Good afternoon, and thanks for joining. I'm Adrian Amos from Synergy Technical, and today we're going to be talking about Entra ID Governance, which is a relatively new-ish component of the Entra ID stack. It's actually, components of it have actually been around since about 2019 or so, but some of them used to exist as components of the Entra ID P2 stack. Some have been moved into the new SKU, some have been new creations, but we're going to dig in. We're going to talk about some of the things that have been added to it and kind of why we're excited about it right now. Now, I will caveat this conversation by saying that what we were originally going to talk about was just Entra ID governance by itself, but as of last week on October 8th, Microsoft released a great big blog post stating that the all-up Entra suite has gone generally available as of October 8th. So we're going to kind of expand this conversation just a little bit to make sure that we're able to touch on some elements that kind of cross some boundaries between the product spaces to make sure that we're able to talk about things as much as they deserve conversation. So the Entra suite, right, now generally available, is composed of 6 principal areas, right? You're going to have Entra private access, Entra internet access. We're not going to talk about those today. We have hinted at the past that those will be topics of future webinars. We will get to that, I promise. It's going to be Entra ID governance, Entra ID protection, and then Entra verified ID. Now, all of these exist on top of just Entra itself, right? And so we got to kind of understand why we need Entra ID governance when we already have Entra itself doing a lot of the heavy lifting. So let's dig in and talk a little bit about what Entra ID governance is, right? Very broadly, it's going to fit into 4 major areas, and we're going to dig into each of these 4 areas, but they're going to be privileged identity management, which, yes, technically is still a component of Entra ID Premium P2. But again, there's some elements here that kind of become more powerful as we look at it as an all-up solution. Entitlement management, and again, yes, there is a very limited subset of entitlement management capabilities in Entra ID P2 as well. But lifecycle workflows, and this is where we sort of step off into, we are purely in the Entra ID governance space, new area, new technologies, really super awesome capabilities around joiner, mover, and leaver processes. And incidentally, this is probably one of the single most important developments in Microsoft Identity Lifecycle Management in years. And I say that because on-premises Active Directory administrators have no automated capabilities for creating user accounts. There's nothing built into Active Directory that says, let me grab your source of truth users from some sort of HR system and provision them in some way that maps attributes in. There are bolt-on solutions that you can bring to it. There's what used to be Forefront Identity Manager is now Microsoft Identity Manager. It's a larger superset of the capabilities that exist in the Entra AD Connect toolset or Entra ID Connect toolset. There have been third-party solutions. There have been administrators building CSV files to map attributes from one system to another. There's been all this stuff. And one of the challenges you get into as your organization grows on premises with Active Directory is, yes, it's all fine and dandy when you're a small 100 plus or sub 100 seat organization to build your users manually. But at a certain point, you get to the size where you need automations layered in. And Active Directory simply doesn't have those things in its toolset. And up until the creation of identity lifecycle workflows as a component of Entra ID governance, we really didn't have any automated capabilities in the cloud either. You could directly connect to Success Factors or Workday, and there's also an Entra ID provisioning service that allows you to bring in identities from other HR systems. But there was no direct capability to bring those in and do something intelligent with them. We have a lot of capabilities there, so we're going to dig deep on that. And then the last part is access reviews. And yes, of course, once again, we have another overlap with capabilities that exist in the Entra Premium P2 space. So we're going to see some things that we've already seen before. We're also going to see some brand new stuff. But handily, Microsoft has actually already released a matrix that breaks down where some of the product tiers overlap. Now, you will note that everything that has a green check in Entra ID governance also has a green check in Entra Suite. And again, that just became generally available last week. So we do hope to circle back and cover some of the content that exists in the greater suite. But we can see there are multiple tiers of Entra ID, and you do have some of these capabilities, even all the way down to the free tier that comes with Office 365. You do have the ability to automatically provision users into SaaS apps, right? When we move up into Intra Premium, we start getting some of the additional provisioning capabilities. And then when we move up into P2, that's when we start getting some of these really cool things, right? Even at a base level, we're able to do entitlement management. At a base level, we're able to do some of the access reviews. And yes, you do get privilege identity management all up as an Entra ID Premium P2 capability. So some of this you will have seen before, but bear with me because we're going to actually expose some new ways that we can do things and how some of these capabilities bear on each other. So when we start digging into what Entra ID Governance is, right, we actually have a brand new dashboard or a brand new blade that lives inside the Entra portal. And many of you guys who have watched our webinars in the past or seen our YouTube videos know that I love to live and die by the live demo. Unfortunately, I rolled the dice on that this morning, and my internet speeds were not what I was hoping for. So we're going to be doing a little bit of canned content. My apologies. This is all from my demo environment. Some things that you will see may look like they have bearing on other things, and they may be and they may not. So we'll just bear with me here, and we'll go with the slides. And I apologize. I can't wait to get back access to faster internet so we can do this live again. But at a very high level, we have this really cool new dashboard. And I say it's really cool because I love the big graphic that's down on the bottom right. So at a high level, we're able to see information about user lifecycle governance, applications that have users assigned directly to them, guest users that may or may not have logged in recently, and global administrators. But this nice little tool, or this nice little dashboard graphic that we have down here, is really showing us that we have actually enabled most of the major components of our identity lifecycle capabilities of Entra ID governance, right? So we have users, we have guests, we have highly privileged roles, we have applications, but we have also configured them to be accessible through lifecycle workflows, through access reviews, through entitlement management, and all that kind of fun stuff. And that's really important because as we have started building out our cloud infrastructure, right, as we've built out our Entra environment over the years, before we had these tools, we had a lot of different ways to bring users to solutions, right? You had your SaaS applications. You could just light up an application. You could connect a user to it. You could maybe in some cases assign different levels of access to those applications. You could add a user to a group. You could assign a group access to a site or a team or whatever it was you wanted to do. You could add guests, right? And all of these things worked. You could even manage dynamic group membership through attributes and all that kind of fun stuff. But the challenge that you got into with a lot of that was keeping visibility over it and wrangling it over time, and then having some sort of way to get proactive insights over what's actually going on with these things. So my very first actual slide of a dashboard is actually clicking into both the guest and the privileged user insights. So I really love this because right off the bat, you can see exactly how many global admins have been identified in your environment, what you maybe ought to think about doing with that, and you can directly remediate this in place. You don't have to go to some sort of secondary location. You just hit make eligible and they just drop to being eligible, and we'll cover what that means in privilege identity management in a moment. The other thing that you have here too, I love this visibility into how long it has been since these guest users last logged in. Now, I did truncate this view. It did actually have a list of all the named users and their explicit last logon times. So you do actually have a lot of great visibility. And again, this is not going into doing and configuring anything. This is just information that surfaced right up. So let's talk about privilege identity management. Okay, this is probably one of the oldest constituent components of what we're going to call the Entra ID governance stack. Again, this does live entirely inside of Entra ID Premium P2. There are even some capabilities that though they are not on the feature matrix as being P1 offerings, they do exist there. And we'll cover a little bit of that in a moment. So, privileged identity management. If you haven't seen it, if you haven't worked with it, this basically takes your privileged identities, your role holders, if you will, in the organization, your domain admin, your global admins, your Intune admins, all of your intra roles that exist, and all of your Azure resource roles. And it says maybe your admins don't really need to be admins 100% of the time. Maybe they really only need to be admins when they're actually logging in to do the administrative work that they need to do. And if that's the case, and your global admins are sitting in meetings Monday through morning from 8 to 4, and they really only get in from about 4 to 5 p.m. to do their actual work. It's just average. Maybe the rest of the week they're planning other things, and they might need ad hoc elevation of privileges from time to time. They don't really need to have an active global admin role all the time. So if we can reduce that to 1 or 2 hours a week, we actually get on average about a 97% reduction in our attack surface for those accounts. That is probably one of the most substantial things you can do beyond simply enabling MFA for these users, right? I mean, a 97% reduction in that attack surface is enormous. And not only is it a reduction in the attack surface, they're actually not queryable through other interfaces as being those role holders if they don't currently hold the role. So when we start looking at what the dashboard enables, we have this ability to assign, activate, approve, and audit. And these are really great. We do actually have all of these capabilities. But we click on the overview, and that's where we see this nice little chart here that shows us the role activations over the last few days, how many people currently hold roles and what roles are held. And then we also get this really cool view of like, what are our major risks? And or alerts. We're going to call them alerts because they call them alerts, but they're really representations of risk. What we see is that in this particular environment, several roles are not currently requiring multi-factor authentication. Several roles are being assigned outside of privileged identity management. So this is a neat thing here too. Once we enable our tenant for PIM, for privileged identity management, whenever anybody adds somebody to a role, just like through some other interface, you actually get an alert on that because that's not how you want administrators adding users to alerts. Now, we'll touch on a caveat to that in a little bit, but we also are able to see that admins aren't using their roles. Are we over assigning? And if you've attended previous webinars or you got to see me talk at RVASec, you have probably heard me talk about the Microsoft reports on like what is the current threat landscape. And one of the biggest things that they find is over assigned administrative permissions, right? So being able to see that information surfaced into here is really super handy. So we're going to dig into this in a little bit here and get a little farther. I apologize, I kind of got ahead of myself. So I did mention that once a user is eligible for a role, or I didn't mention this, caveat. When a user is eligible for a role, they have to go through an activation process. And you'll see over here on the left, we have what roles I currently hold, what requests are available for me, what approvals I have pending, and then there's access review capabilities. When I don't hold these roles, as I said, you cannot query me directly through things like the Microsoft 365 Admin Center as being a role holder. And that's really important because this is not the way things work in Active Directory. In Active Directory, you add users to role holding groups like global admins. But a neat thing happens to the account once it's been added to that group. It's not just as simple as putting the user in the group and then pulling them out. There's actually an immutable security attribute on that account that is admin. And if a user has never been added to one of those role holding groups, the value is 0. You put them in that group, it becomes 1. It is immutable. It never goes back. Users who have access to query LDAP can say, pull all the accounts where isAdmin equals 1, and they've done all of their lateral movement investigation, right? So that isn't a capability within Entra ID for accounts that are managed through PIM or roles that are managed through PIM. If a user doesn't currently hold the role, it is not queryable. And that might sound a little bit like some security through obscurity, but any little bit helps, right? When the bad guys are trying to look for lateral movement. So other thing that we've seen here too, and this is not a caution against, this is actually still best practice, is that a lot of organizations may say, well, I don't need to worry about this because I do all of my administrative work through a secondary account and I have higher monitoring on that account. But I will caution you to look at your practices on your secondary security accounts because a lot of organizations pick a very similar naming convention to their standard usernames and they just bolt on a _ADM or some sort of predictable character set. And then because admins are humans, they tend to do things like recycle passwords or recycle that additional character set onto the end or put a 1 on the end. So just because you have those secondary accounts doesn't mean that they are not in and of themselves an enormous attack surface. We do strongly recommend that organizations that are considering, do I ever even need to look at anything like an Entra ID P2 for anything, they look at it for administrative accounts first, simply to gain access to PIM. All right, I'm going to get off that soapbox. So when we start talking about what those alerts surface for us and what they can mean for us, you can see that I have this ability to report directly on roles that don't require MFA. And you can see, actually, while I was building out this deck, I identified several of the roles, checked them off here, and clicked the fix button. And you can see that Azure in the background was actually implementing my fixes. So again, we don't really have to go super deep in the tool set to figure out, how do I remediate this? How do I move forward? How do I make great improvements? And roles are being assigned outside of privileged identity management. So the newer native interface of Entra, if you have privileged identity management and you go to a user account and you say add a role to this user, you'll actually notice that it says privileged identity management in there. This is an improvement over what we used to see, where if you did that, you would start generating alerts. But, and we'll get to this in a minute, there are still ways that you can add a user to a role, and now you get alerts on those as well. So we're not worried about missing out on things. We actually can directly see, based on audits, when users gained access to roles, how they gained access to the role, what the target was, and how they, all this kind of fun stuff, right? So, and we'll cover all of that in a couple minutes as well. Now, I said all of the Entra roles, and there's something like 95 of these roles. This has been an element that Microsoft has been continuing to improve upon over the last couple of years. It used to be that Intune had its roles in a silo, and Purview had its roles in a silo, and I think everything had its own roles in a silo, but they've really worked really hard to bring all of those roles together into a unified view. And as we start looking at these, you can see, a description of what these are. I did not break the roles open into all of their constituent capabilities and what they offer, but I did want to dig into this and show you 95-ish roles. And when we start digging into defining how those roles are activated, what does it mean to protect this role with PIM? We can control the activation window, how long a user is able to hold it before it goes away and they have to re-request it, from 0.5 hours all the way up to 24 hours. We can define that on activation, they're going to be required to step up their authentication, whether it's MFA or we've created an authentication context that we manage with conditional access. Decide whether or not they're going to require justification on activation, decide whether or not there's going to be an approval process, who those approvals are, and then who gets notified, right? Somebody has activated global admin. You might want a little bit of an email to kind of go around to the other global admins and let them know. Certainly at a minimum, everybody who has access to PIM roles is going to get a weekly report on who is activating or how many roles have been activated, how many users have been activated outside of it. And the other thing that we also get the visibility into is how we're going to make this assignment. Is it going to be a permanent active assignment, a permanent eligible assignment, or are we actually going to time bound it, not just with the 0.5 to 24 hours, but are we actually going to say you're only eligible to request this role through the end of this year? And that's a really important part of what we get out of going into this Entra ID governance thing, because one of the biggest security challenges is not errors in software, it's errors in configuration. You've brought in a vendor, a contractor, a consultant, an employee, and they're on a limited time basis. They have a 90-day probationary period. For whatever reason, you get to that 90 days and either the contract terminates or the company decided not to pick them up. Their account isn't disabled or their access isn't removed. You can actually time constrain their ability not just to have it, but also to request it to a specific date in the future. So you can see in this case, Carl Edwards has been added to an eligible role holder. So he is able to come in and request access to this role, but he will lose that ability on New Year's Eve at 5 p.m. I don't have to remember to go back and check on New Year's Day next year. It's just gone. He's not going to have the ability to request it. And if that is an error and I need to re-add it, we can deal with that then. I would prefer to lose access and manage than to have to worry about losing data because I forgot. So the other thing that we can do is actually add privileged identity management to groups and to Azure resources. Now, I touched on Azure resources for a moment, but I will point out Azure resources do not present their roles in the same way to PIM that Entra does. Entra is very tidy. If I want to be a global admin, I know exactly what the rights are that are going to align to that. With with Azure resource roles, Literally any resource I have in Azure, in any subscription, in any management group, in any resource group, in any resource itself, they're going to have very different capabilities. A Sentinel environment is going to have very different Azure rights from a storage group, from a virtual machine. When we start looking at complex Azure Virtual Desktop environments, we think about limiting costs, so scaling down the environment at the end of the day. We want to give users the ability to start a machine on Connect. That's how we're actually going to manage that there, right? That's an Azure resource right that we'll build out through PIM here for those users. So it's very different in how we do that, but you can actually do all of it in PIM. And then we can also add privileged identity management to groups. And there's a couple different ways that we can do this too. One is actually we can just make a group in Entra hold a role. Easy. We can also make users have to be eligible to gain access to a group. There's a couple different reasons why we might want to choose that. We might have multiple roles assigned to a group and we want to have a user go through an eligibility upgrade, or we may need to instantiate a disaster team that deals with like a whole bunch of roles, but it's for a whole bunch of people and they come in at one time and we have to raise it all up. So there's a lot of different ways that we can meet the needs of our admins. And then those will actually have trickle effects as we go down into entitlement management, and this is my jam. So way back in like 2019 or so, this started to pop up as a capability in the at the time it was in the Azure portal, and this gives us the ability to take access to a bunch of resources, bundle it up, and present it to users in a way that makes sense, like what we would have done traditionally in on-premises environment. So let me explain that. In Active Directory, we had domain global groups and we had domain local groups. Early best practices documentation very clearly stated that users should be added to domain global groups and resource access should be granted to domain local groups. And a domain global group should be then added to the domain local groups that give access to those resources. So a domain global group should roughly be a role in your organization. Say it's a help desk technician, say it's an HR generalist, say it's whatever job titles you may have. And ideally, the way that you get the most scalable results in Active Directory with permissions is you have every HR generalist just be a member of the HR generalist domain global group. And then that domain global group is a member of all the little domain local groups for the HR file share that has read to this, that has write to that, that has some sort of access to the application, that has all that stuff. So your users are really only in one group. That group then gives them access to everything else. It's very, very rare to see this actually done in Active Directory, but we actually can do this and do it very cleanly in entitlement management with access packages. So access packages, again, we can do this really any way we want to, right? I like to organize it along the lines of, again, those named job roles in my environment. You can see I've played around with some other things. When we do security immersion experiences or productivity immersion experiences, I'll actually put the users in my demo tenant into the appropriate access package so that they can gain access to the tools that they need to go through that process. In many cases, though, we're actually going to have a lot of different overlapping rules. And so we can actually assign multiple access packages to a single user at a time, and we can do it lots of different ways. So at a very high level, I've got a whole bunch of access packages. What in the world do they have in them? Well, they're actually built from catalogs, okay? So catalogs give us the ability to recognize that, you know what? I may be the IT guy, but the finance guys know a whole lot more about what resources they need to protect than I do. So I can actually take a finance subject matter expert or a sponsor in the organization and say, can you just like put in a list of what are all the resources that finance needs to do? I'm going to give you the access to come in here and just populate this list. It can be websites, it can be teams, it can be groups, it can be applications, it can even include, to a limited extent, Entra roles. And again, we're going to touch on some of the caveats that are there. So I can give access to the IT catalog out to somebody in my organization, and they can just stuff it full of all the different apps, teams, SharePoint sites, right, if we want to, applications, all that kind of fun stuff. And then they're going to also give us the ability to create access packages. And we can actually license that capability down to them too, if we want to. not license, we can entitle them to do that if we want. We can also hold it for ourselves. We can also make these catalogs visible both to internal resources and external resources. So we can actually take catalogs and make things available to contractors directly. So they come in with their B2B account. We don't even need to provision them an account. We can just give them access to our environment named to their actual user and track it and then revoke it as necessary. It's really cool, and we'll dig into that. So we're going to look at our IT catalog, right? And inside of this IT catalog, again, we have all the resources, all the things that an IT person might need to work with. They're going to have applications, they're going to have groups, teams, SharePoint sites, and this Intune administrator role. Just an example. Within that catalog, we're also going to have multiple access packages. Now, this is not intended to be representative of an entire IT department. This was just me putting things together. You can see we have our security analyst, we have our help desk technician, we have our IT manager, but we also have this break glass package. And this is actually a really neat way that we can build packages for emergency access, and you can actually make it so that they are hidden. So a user has to know the actual explicit URL. So when you go break open the safe and you pull out the credentials that are written down on the piece of paper, and then you got the URL for what's the emergency access to break glass and get in, you can build all of that into a single process. It's really neat. And then again, we can define our roles and administrators. You can actually bring logic apps and park them right here into this catalog as well. We're not doing that in this environment, but we can do that. So let's talk about the security analyst role itself. So as a catalog owner, the IT guy may just know that he needs to grant access to Intune portal and all these other fun things, but he's not defining the actual access necessary to that portal. We do that in the package. So maybe the Intune admin who's logging in to just do security analyst stuff really just needs to query things. But the IT help desk role, different role, needs to have the ability to actually do things like assign applications, create configuration profiles, do all that kind of fun stuff. So we can actually set separate levels of access to applications, to groups and teams. I can make somebody a member. I can make somebody an owner. When it comes to the SharePoint sites, I can do visitors, members, and owners as well. So we have lots of different ways that we can actually craft the actual permissions to the resource within the package itself to make sure that we get the right granular access controls that we need. And we can also make sure through separation of duties that if you are requesting the security analyst role, you do not also currently hold the compliance officer role. And there's an interesting distinction here, and this took me a while to figure out. So we have incompatible access packages, incompatible groups, and incompatible with. The incompatible access packages are going to be sourced from the same catalog you're currently building in. Incompatible groups, you can actually say if somebody is in this group in Entra, they can't hold this access package. And this actually is a really nice way to make sure that as we are building this environment and moving from traditionally just like add user to group, we can honor those barriers as we build these packages and make sure that we're not creating conflicts. But we can also add roles or access packages that exist in different catalogs. And it's interesting because you would think that they would all show up in this list, but they don't. They actually show up as a different list of incompatible with. That's all right. So we can define our incompatibilities many different ways. Once we have all this, we actually have the ability to then decide how somebody gets this package. And you can do as many policies as you want to deploy this, but I actually have 3 principal ones for the security analyst role, and all of them have actually worked in this environment. I actually tragically created this slide right before it picked up and caught one automatically. But I can actually, like I mentioned earlier, assign this to somebody who's external to my organization. Back at the root level of identity governance, I had the ability to add connected organizations, and I've added Synergy Technical and a description of what Synergy Technical is so that other people in the organization know why we're doing business with them. I can add internal sponsors at this company, and I can also add external sponsors, people at Synergy, who would be responsible for approving this access request. So let's say you've brought Synergy Technical in to do an outsource SOC or managed services or whatever it is that you might have us come in and do. You could actually create us as a partner organization, create the roles and packages that you want us to be able to use, and then name a sponsor that says, I know that Dan Finn, VP of Sales, is the guy who's responsible for bringing people in from Synergy to do this job. I don't really need to go through the process of doing deep level vetting for each one of these people individually. Dan is responsible for providing people. If Dan says this guy is okay, I'm good with it. So what we would do then is, as somebody comes in and requests that package, the first person to get an email saying package requested is Dan. Dan then hits approve, and then we can actually set up to 3 different tiers of approval, feeling back to the on-premises sponsor. So whoever it was who hired Dan to bring people in can then say, yeah, Dan says they're good, I say they're good. And then we can add that third person, which could actually be somebody in IT specifically, to make sure that we're not all just, losing our minds and bringing in people that we don't want. So we have a lot of different levels of approval that we can assign here. We can impose that people have to answer a specific question or meet some particular security attribute in order to be able to request this. I have it actually covered up here, but we can also add verified ID, which allows you to do things like check against some sort of external identity provider to ensure that a key attribute is held at a given time. But wait, there's more, because that's only the contractor's request, right? I can actually say, if somebody in the organization's Entra ID account says that they are a security analyst, if that's their job title and their department matches IT, we can just automatically assign this to them, and we don't make them go through jumping through a bunch of hurdles. We can also publish this access package so that a user sees it in their list of available packages and can request it. So if we need to have somebody able to come on to support us in a network emergency, they can request the package and we can get them up and running very quickly. So let's talk about what the user sees. Okay, so we've done all the admin side, we've built out the packages, we've set all this stuff up. For the user, they simply go to a website called myaccess.microsoft.com. There, they're going to have access up in the top corner here to the apps they own, the groups they're members of, and the access packages that they have access to request. They're also going to see the entire history of their entire access packages and all that kind of fun stuff. And I mean the entire history. Like, this goes back years. This is not like Entra's audit logs that only go back 30 days. This is years. If they are in somebody's approval chain, they'll be able to get that here in addition to the email that will notify them. If there are access reviews, and we're going to get to that before I run out of time, they will see their access reviews here as well. So user comes here, they say click on any one of these. They don't, even before they click on request, they can just click on the name and it'll pop up this list of what are the things that they would be asking for. If they hit request, they're going to have the choice in some cases, and this is a preview capability, of requesting it for themselves or for someone else. Now, right now in preview, this capability only allows you to support direct reports, and I actually really love this, right? One of the things that we see as organizations get really big is they want to have extremely tight controls and very, very granular automation, such that job title does everything, right? You get into the department and the job title and you play plinko and you get down into the role that you need and the access package is simply delivered. And that's fantastic. That works for some organizations. In some cases, though, you join the marketing team and you may be the graphic designer, but potentially the web lead is unwell. They're out for the week. Someone's got to cover that role. The marketing director in that case might simply say, you know what, I really need somebody to be my web lead this week, and I'm going to assign this to Jens Voigt, and there they go. They're off to the races. They simply will get access to those resources. So we can support lots of different ways for people to gain access to the tools they need to do the job they need to do. And it's super duper simple. Now, I did mention that there is a really interesting interaction that occurs between privilege identity management and entitlement management. And I ran through this, and I hope this slide will build the way that I want it to. So this is a little bit of a caveat here, right? So I created a role in an access package, and you may have seen it on the previous screen. It said role assignments through entitlement management, not PIM. And I'll call out that while we can add intra roles to access packages, this is in preview and it's a little bit raw. Right now, most roles only allow you to add them as an eligible member. So even after you access this package, you light this package up, you would still then have to go in as that person to the Entra portal, hit my roles, request access, and go through the secondary approvals. Now at that point, you might be 4 approvals in before you gain access to this role. There are a few roles, however, where you can be activated immediately upon lighting up this access package. And I've been very excited about this capability because, again, entitlement management allows you to do 3 levels of approvals, and it's in a unified space. And why would you want to send users to multiple portals if you don't have to? But a really interesting thing happens here. So I've got a couple of roles here that are going to be active members. and they're going to be the edge administrator and the attack simulation administrator. So when my user goes to light this thing up, they'll notice here, though, also that they're only going to be eligible for conditional access, okay? So I'm looking at this user post-activation, and I can see now that my user has assigned access to Attack Simulator and Edge Administrator exactly as I would have expected, because those are active designations. I can also see that my user is now eligible for conditional access, but I still have to go through as that user and activate that. So now I can click on my activation window, and I'll then see that that is now an active assignment, and it's going to show me exactly when that assignment is going to end. I, as the user, can click on this to deactivate it. Now that's all really interesting, right? I love the fact that I got my direct access into these two roles. However, I also got an alert in Privilege Identity Management stating that those two roles were assigned out of band. So be mindful of how you build your access packages with intro roles. I have mentioned this to some of my Microsoft engineer friends. I do hope to get some feedback from that fairly soon. But I did also mention that you have some really, really deep level information about what's actually happening when you light these up. I mean, like the logs go back for years. But when you look actually at what's happening with an access package in your audit logs, you're going to see that any access that's managed in an access package doesn't exist until the user activates the package. And this is a really fascinating thing. So when a user wants to gain access to, let's say it's 4 or 5 groups, you can look in intro right now, they're not in there. When you go and activate that package as that user, that access is created in real time. So when the help desk goes back to figure out why are you not able to print, well, they can see you have direct access to the printer, you're in there, they don't need to add you manually. And if it is mistaken or if something has happened wonky, they can actually go back and reprocess. That's also in preview, is reprocess access package, and it should trigger them to get those resources. So you can see here all of the stuff that was done in the demo, where this was the actual activation thing for the role. It all happened. It was all super duper quick, really easy. But you can see in a lot of cases that Azure AD, they have not renamed it to Entra ID, Identity Governance was actually the tool that instantiated some of these processes. All right. Whew. So really cool. Dig into that. But now let's build on it a little bit, because again, as I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest weaknesses in Active Directory is it doesn't have lifecycle workflows built in. You as an administrator have to create those, right? And up until about 3 years ago, there were no lifecycle workflows in Entra either, but they have landed and they have now found a home inside of Entra ID Governance as a licensing vehicle. So what they allow us to do is manage a whole bunch of different workflows, track how those workflows are working, and also turn them on or off or run them ad hoc and keep track of what's happening. When we start to build these things out, they are aligned primarily to joiner, mover, leaver processes. Not even primarily, that's just how they're aligned. We have 10 basic templates that are in here. They do align again to joiner, mover, leaver. There are 2 that are available to run as on demand as templates. And defining or choosing the template will actually predefine for you some of the capabilities that will be in there. However, we can get in and totally customize these things. So we'll be able to do all kinds of stuff. So let's dig into that. All right. So these are the lifecycle workflows that I have in my environment right now. I can click on create a workflow. I can see my list. I can see that these things are running on an automated schedule. And incidentally, that's just a high level component about lifecycle workflows. You simply define what the schedule is. In my environment, it's every 3 hours. We can also see whether or not these are enabled. Now, enabled and scheduled may seem very similar, but enabled is going to mean that you can click on any one of these guys and click on run on demand. If it's not enabled, you can't do that. And so those things like real-time terminations, all that kind of fun stuff, you want to make sure that those are enabled, that you can do all the fun things that you want to do. I will call out, when you are naming these, you do not get pretty naming conventions. You do not get pretty numbering conventions. And so it's very important as you're building this environment out to make sure that if you want to see them in the order that they are processed, that you come up with some sort of logical naming structure. And you also get the version history. And this too goes back years. Right? So I actually created this environment years ago, and I can see the entire version history of the onboarding pre-hire process for employees. And we'll dig into that in just a moment. So we look at any particular lifecycle workflow component, and I've just grabbed the 03 help desk tech first day tasks. So my prior to the first day, we're going to do things like create the account and disable it, right? We don't want an enabled unmonitored account sitting out there. But on the user's first day, we're going to enable the account. We're going to add them to some groups. We're going to send them a welcome email. So my second task in 02 was actually to add the license to the user 7 days before the event, before they started. Send them a welcome email, request access packages, and then generate the temporary access pass and send an email to their supervisor. All of this is automated, right? And I can dig in and add all these additional tasks if I want to as well. There's lots of different stuff. I covered up some of it, and the list actually goes beyond what I have here. But we can define what our triggers are going to be, and we can define to whom this action is going to occur, right? In my case, they're in IT and they're on the help desk. When you start building these out, you do want to start really broad and narrow in as you go. Otherwise, you'll have 1,000 pre-hire tasks for every single department of your organization, and you'll find a lot of overlap. So just like conditional access policies in the past and configuration profiles in Intune, it's very easy to get sprawl. So I do strongly recommend coming up with a naming convention, sticking with it. So mention these triggers. And this has been something that's changed a lot over the last couple of years. In fact, I didn't actually even notice when it did change, and I'm excited that it did. These used to be time-based attributes only. And this is one of the really powerful things that happened with lifecycle workflows, is this was intended to say, you're actually creating your identities in something like SuccessFactors, Workday, or some other third-party solution. Maybe you're sourcing them in through some sort of identity provisioning mechanism. Once they're in, then what, right? And if you bring them in through an HR provisioning system, you almost always get the employee hire date as part of that. So we could actually use that, and we did for years. Actually, I think it was like 2 years, but that was really the only thing you could do. From the time of creation or from the time of hire, these are my triggering events. But now we have the ability to trigger these based on a department or any other attribute, like literally any attribute you can query. And then also on group changes. So again, I mentioned with PIM, like you want to make sure that as you're building these out, or access packages, that you're able to honor the existing investments you have in your already, we're not going to call it legacy, but the environment that you already have, right? So if you've done it all through groups before and you're looking at this, you want to make sure that as you add users to a group or remove them from a group, you're able to use those as the triggers to build these new processes out. And then you can always go back and change them. So pretty cool. All right. So on our 01, I did mention that we're going to look at version history here, and this is actually really cool. So you can look down through the entire version history. You can see I've renamed it a few times. You can see that I've changed the things that are happening. It used to be targeted at the marketing department. Now it's targeted at the IT department. Realistically, this shouldn't be targeted at any department. This should be just how I do this for everybody inside the organization. We're going to assign them a license. We were originally generating the tap in an email, but you know what you can't do? You can't send much useful information to people if they don't already have a license. So we've built this up. We've changed it a lot. And again, you can see these are things that have happened over time. Incidentally, I do think it's interesting that you're not able to see when I created that. That's neat. Anyway, we have a lot of version history here, and this will just continue to change and grow as users change these processes. And you also get workflow monitoring and insights that come along with this too. So, how many times has it run over the last 7 days? What happened when it ran? You can see in this particular case here, I triggered a process to run on a user who was actually already licensed and already protected with MFA. And it tripped over trying to send them a temporary access pass because they're already protected with MFA. So the protections that are in here against pushing a user back down a level are pretty nice, but you'll be able to get in and see exactly what has worked, what hasn't worked, what their history has run, not just by runs, but also by individual users and by the actual tasks that are associated with the identity lifecycle workflow. There's a lot that's in here. Again, joiner, mover, leaver, real-time termination. I really had some cool stuff that was in the real-time termination, but we'll have to circle back to that on a date when I have better internet. All right. The last major constituent component of what we're going to be talking about today is access reviews. And again, this is another area where we are so far ahead of what was possible with Active Directory and where we were in Azure AD 5 years ago. Traditionally, in my history as an Active Directory admin, I was asked every 6 months by auditors to come back and give a list of all the people who had the global admin role and justify it. And that was probably my least favorite task ever as an admin, because how do you do that? Well, you run a PowerShell query that pulls back the list of all the global admins, and then you email them all. And you say, do you still need this? And in the history of ever, no one has ever said, oh, I don't need that anymore. They all want to hold on to that power. Then you're back and forth with, well, are you sure you need it? Because I don't really want to tell the auditor that. And then you have to sit down with the auditor and explain why you still have 21 global admins, right? And that's not a lot of fun. Access reviews can actually take a lot of that pain away and put it back on the role holders, so that you're not the bad guy anymore. The system just manages it for you. So we're actually going to start with having a whole bunch of different access reviews that are in a list. Incidentally, you can create programs, and those programs are simply logical groupings of your access reviews. The way that they're currently structured, you don't get anything out of having them in a program other than you can delete the program and the access reviews associated with it go away. But if you want to build out programs for potentially future use, I would love to actually see where auditors can be invited into a program. That would be great, Microsoft. Anyway, so we have multiple programs that we can support, but we also just have multiple access reviews, right? And as we dig into the default program, which is where all of your access reviews are going to go unless you create them inside of another one, caveat to that, you're going to see which ones are monitoring apps, which ones are monitoring groups, which ones are currently running. You'll see the names of the actual access reviews that are there, and then you can actually come in and start digging into what's in them. Now, again, there's another weird little caveat to this, and that is that it would be less interesting for me to show you what the constituent components are of an existing access review, because they're actually not really surfaced very well inside the views. And I didn't capture a view to show you that because it's not a great view. What is a great view, and where you can see all the cool things you can do, is when you're building it. So I'm going to caution you, when you're building these out, do a few to kind of get your feet wet, but when you're ready to start doing things that actually have an impact, really go through and map out what it is that you want to do and document them as you build them. Because looking at them later is not the cleanest way to look at things. So with that in mind, when we build an access review, we're going to define what it is that we're reviewing, whether it's going to be teams and groups or applications, and the choice there is going to pop in a whole bunch more stuff. So I started with teams and groups. It's going to give me the ability to decide which teams and groups. Do I want to exclude certain things? Do I want to do guest users only or all users? And incidentally, one of the pre-canned queries that Microsoft recommends that you do is a query against guest users that are inactive in your environment, or groups that have guest users that don't have access to any other resources in your environment. So they're kind of suggesting some great things that you want to go through and look at. Anyway, you can see that we can filter these things down and scope them as tightly as we want to. And we can also define what constitutes inactive, right? Is it 30 days inactive? Is it 90? Is it whatever, right? Once we go through defining the thing that we want to review and any exclusions that may be there, we're going to define what a review looks like. And we can actually do up to 3 different stages of reviews. Now I've only built this out to 2, but you can see you can add an additional stage here. And we're going to start with saying, in this particular bogus environment, we have lots of different ways that we can do these reviews. So users can review their own access. Do you still need global admin, right? They have 3 days to answer. Then it goes to their manager. And if the manager doesn't respond in 3 days, we can define a failback reviewer that says some particular named person. We can then again add an additional stage. And what's neat here is that we can actually now, this is relatively new, show the decisions and the results to the next stage. So if I send out 21 emails saying, do you still need to be global admin? And 21 people say, sure do, buddy. That goes back to their admin, to their managers, and they all can see, yeah, they took this a little glibly, right? Or maybe they can see, hey, this is actually really important, but they can get that contextual information, right, before they choose to process this. Once they have decided to either advance it or kill it, if it is going to continue to be advanced, then we can only advance those things to the next stage based on what the previous decisions have been. So like if somebody said it's approved or denied, that's it. That's the end of it, right? We're going to do whatever it is and we're going to move on. But before we move on to the next stage, we're going to only choose to advance this process for reviews where somebody said they didn't know or they didn't answer, right? And then we're going to decide what is going to happen as a result of this review. Are we going to do nothing and simply notify people through email that there's still 21 global admins? Or are we going to remove access because you didn't take this seriously and you didn't provide a proper justification or whatever? There's also take recommendations, which builds on some logic here too. It's going to work a little bit better on group memberships than some of the other things. But if somebody wants to, approve something, that you can force them to provide justification. You can set reminders. You can get emails. And you can drown in emails on these things too. So it's not going to be like they can say, "I didn't know that I had that happening." They will get some daggone emails about it. And I actually really love this. And this is one of the things I didn't build a slide on this, but you saw earlier that I have a break glass access package. And I also have break glass as a group in my Entra environment. I really wish I could show you this, because one of the things that I really enjoy with that is showing people how we build exclusions into conditional access policies for break glass environments, for break glass users, break glass groups. That creates a blind spot. And I have very, very clearly seen in the past where organizations put something into a conditional access exclusion that itself was not monitored. And one of the access reviews, and I think I can go back to it here, is, here we go, standing membership in the break glass group. Strongly recommend this. Like, if you start with nothing else in your access reviews, start here. If you have a break glass group, you want to make sure that that group is empty and it stays empty. So in this case, this particular access review runs weekly, and it simply verifies that there are no members in that group. I don't ever want to see a member in that group. If I see a member in that group, I want to sound alarm bells. I want to light up dashboards. I want to do all kinds of fun stuff. This allows me to do that. And what's really neat too is that even if this is an environment that's hybrid with on-premises Active Directory, if I'm simply replicating over the existence of an emergency access group, I can do an access review on it and ensure that that is at least notified on, even if I don't have something like group write back enabled. So there's a lot that's in here. I highly recommend be cautious, learn what access reviews can do. Certainly be careful with the results of the review before you enact them, because you don't want to have users getting access removed unnecessarily. Whew. That's it. There's a lot that's in here. I really thank you for your time. I'm going to open it up for any questions. Actually, if you give me a second, I have to switch screens because I'm not able to see the Q&A screen. So hold on for me 1 second. Okay, so yeah, all right, great one. So one of the first questions that was in here goes back to, as mentioning in access reviews, was the programs. The question is, why would you organize access reviews into programs? What do you get for that? And yeah, I think I mentioned there really isn't anything right now that you get for it. I'm really hoping to see that developed later on. I actually was poking around in some of the documentation online to see if maybe it was something that you get through PowerShell. It doesn't really seem that there is. It really does look like it's just a logical way to organize them. And like I said, if you want an access review to exist inside of a specific program, you actually have to create it there inside that program. Otherwise, it's going to go into that default business flow. Hope that helps. Let's see. Yeah, okay, so access packages. Question is, let me see if I can phrase this in a way that I can answer in an easy way. Question pertains to organizing access packages in a way that reduces the number of touches for a user. I think I've got that right. And so I did mention that, in the past we would have added users to lots of different groups. We would have added users in the enterprise applications area to lots of different applications. We would have done all of these things very manually, maybe managed it through some sort of attribute filtering for dynamic groups. But again, we do run into those Entra roles. So when a user lights up an access package, that's it for them. That's their whole touch. They have no other thing they have to do unless they also have an Entra role as part of that access package. They may have to go through an activation. But the users can actually see, it's not quite real time, but it will show them while they are activating the package. It'll say the request is there. If it's held up in an approval, that may be a touch for somebody else. But if it's not held up in approval, if approval is automatic, then they will actually see delivering as part of it. And then like after a couple of seconds, they'll see that the package has been granted. At that point, because the user's already in the My Access website, they should actually go up to the top left and click on My Apps and My Groups, and they'll be able to see their accesses right there. So it happens very quickly. There's really no secondary touch, again, unless you have a role that makes you eligible to hold it. And again, for admins too, there's no having to go back and do anything else, right? So you want to craft those packages to give those users as many of the resources as necessary to do their job. So that you don't have to go in and plug any gaps. Nicely, though, unlike access reviews, you can very easily add things back into those packages. In fact, I didn't cover it, but when you're building out your packages, you can actually add resources that were not identified as being a part of the catalog. So you have to click a checkbox to see those and to get access to them. So you do want to make sure that your catalog owners are capturing all the things that are necessary for their users, but you can, as an admin, say, oops, this was missed, and you can go back in and add it after the fact. But again, there's no real touch to that, right? It's just making sure that the package has what you want. All right, those are the two big ones. If you have any questions, please reach out. We would love to hear from you, and I'm really excited about access packages. I've actually kind of been on a bit of a high for those for like years. When I was at Microsoft back in 2019 at a security airlift, I was actually asking, hey, is this kind of like how you're seeing servicing identity for B2B and decentralized identity? And they were like, yes, but don't talk about that. So it's been 5 years. I figure it's time to talk about that. The verified ID capabilities and the connected organizations. If you haven't looked at that, like we've seen so many of our organizations, our customers switch from like the high level partner admin stuff to granular delegated admin. This kind of takes that even a level further and just says like, look, I need people to come in and do a role. I own the role. You own the account. I can track your account. And it's fantastic. I strongly advise it. You can even assign roles to guest members. So you don't need to be in the business of creating identities to manage guest access. I love it. All right, I'm gonna get off that soapbox. Thank you so much for joining. And I hope you have a great Halloween and the rest of your cybersecurity awareness month goes without any incident. Thanks for joining. Catch you next time.